If you went to see a doctor in 1850, you had a better chance of surviving if you just stayed home. That's not a joke. That's a statistic. Before we get to the most jaw-dropping case, let's start with the drug that was in literally everything: mercury. From the 1600s all the way through the 1800s, mercury was medicine. It was in pills, tonics, skin creams, and the most common prescription drug in America, a compound called calomel, which is mercury chloride. Doctors prescribed it for fevers, constipation, teething, infections, and basically anything else they couldn't explain. The standard dose for syphilis treatment in England was 325 milligrams of mercury per day, every day, for up to 2 years straight. Think about that number for a second. 325 milligrams, daily, for 2 years. The side effects had names that sound like Victorian horror fiction. Mercurial erethism, that's extreme depression, uncontrollable sadness, and what doctors described as excessive sighing. Then came the tremors. Then your gums started rotting. Your teeth fell out. Holes opened up in your jaw and face. Your tongue ulcerated. You lost your mind. The phrase "mad as a hatter" wasn't a fairy tale. Hat makers in the 1800s used mercury to cure felt, and the real diagnosis was mercury poisoning. It was a documented, named condition. But here's the part that makes this genuinely terrifying. When syphilis goes untreated, it sometimes naturally goes into remission on its own. Symptoms disappear. The patient looks better. And for 300 years, doctors looked at that and said, the mercury is working. 3 centuries of mass poisoning went completely undetected because the disease kept accidentally covering for the cure. And it wasn't just poor people getting dosed with this stuff. In 1801, King George III was treated with calomel. The exact same compound was simultaneously used as a horticultural fungicide. Farmers used it as a root dip to prevent disease in cabbages and broccoli. The medicine they gave to kings was the same chemical farmers were spraying on their vegetable gardens. Calomel stayed in agricultural use until 1971, but as horrifying as the mercury story is, it doesn't explain why doctors kept doing this. To understand that, you need to understand one man, Benjamin Rush, signer of the Declaration of Independence, one of the most respected physicians in American history, and almost certainly responsible for thousands of deaths, including one of the most famous deaths in American history. Rush built the entire philosophical framework of 19th century American medicine. He called it heroic medicine, and the core belief was this: all disease comes from one source, friction in the blood and blockage in the intestines. So the cure for everything, fevers, infections, mental illness, yellow fever, you name it, was the same: bleed the patient. Then dose them with calomel until they vomited and purged continuously. The more violent the body's response, the more the disease was being expelled. During the 1793 Philadelphia yellow fever epidemic, Rush bled and purged his patients so aggressively that his critics nicknamed him the mortal angel of death. He is believed to have killed thousands, but the most famous victim of heroic medicine wasn't an anonymous patient in Philadelphia. It was George Washington. In December 1799, Washington developed a throat infection, almost certainly epiglottitis, a swelling of the tissue above the voice box. His 3 physicians, all trained in Rush's methods, went to work. In a single day, they removed over 80 ounces of his blood. That's roughly 40% of the total blood volume in his body, gone in one day. They also dosed him with calomel, applied blistering agents to his skin to make him sweat, and gave him an enema. Washington died the next night. Modern retrospective diagnosis: he likely would have survived the infection. He died from blood loss and shock. Now, here's the logical trap that kept this system alive for decades. Rush's patients were dying. He knew they were dying. But because the treatments were so extreme, because patients were bleeding out and purging constantly, they died before the symptoms of mercury poisoning could even develop. So Rush looked at his dead patients and concluded the disease killed them, not the cure. His treatments were so violent that they hid their own side effects. The logic was airtight and completely wrong, and it kept calomel in use for another 60 years. How embedded was this? During the Civil War, when the Union Army's Surgeon General tried to ban calomel, tried to stop feeding soldiers mercury, he was removed from his post. Banning the poison was a firing offense. That's important. But if you thought mercury was the most direct way 19th century medicine killed people, wait until you hear about what was happening in the operating room. Before anesthesia, surgery was a controlled nightmare. Patients were held down by strong men. They screamed through the entire procedure. The only mercy a surgeon could offer was speed, and no surgeon in London was faster than Robert Liston. Liston could amputate a leg fully, cleanly, in 28 to 30 seconds. Before every operation, he would turn to his medical students with their stopwatches and shout, "Time me, gentlemen, time me." Crowds would come to watch him work. He was a celebrity. And then there was the operation. In his most infamous case, Liston moved so fast that he simultaneously amputated the patient's leg, cut off the fingers of his own surgical assistant, and slashed the coat of a spectator standing too close. The patient died days later from gangrene. The assistant died days later from gangrene. The spectator, who wasn't even cut, collapsed from shock believing he'd been stabbed and died of fright. 3 people died from one surgery, a 300% mortality rate, the only one ever recorded in medical history. But here's the thing, Liston wasn't uniquely reckless. The mortality numbers from that entire era are staggering. At London Hospital between 1852 and 1857, 46% of all amputation patients died. Nearly half. And when chloroform anesthesia was introduced, the supposed miracle that would finally make surgery humane, it made things worse. 70% of chloroform amputation patients died, compared to 43% without it. The miracle drug was more deadly than nothing. And most of those patients didn't die on the table. They survived the operation. They survived the agony. Then, several days later, they developed massive infections and died. Surgical mortality wasn't a knife problem. It was a contamination problem. And the man who figured that out paid for it with his life. Vienna, 1840s. General Hospital. 2 maternity wards, side by side. Ward 1 was staffed by doctors and medical students. Ward 2 was staffed by midwives. Ward 1 had a maternal mortality rate of nearly 10%. Ward 2 had a rate of about 3.6%. The doctors were killing nearly 3 times as many new mothers as the midwives. Women admitted to the hospital were begging to be put in the midwife ward. Some gave birth in the street on purpose to avoid the doctors. A Hungarian physician named Ignác Semmelweis noticed one key difference between the 2 wards. The doctors and medical students were going directly from performing autopsies on cadavers to delivering babies without washing their hands. The midwives never did autopsies. The students were transferring decomposed cadaver matter directly into open wounds during childbirth. Semmelweis introduced mandatory hand washing with chlorinated lime solution. Mortality in the doctor's ward dropped from 18% to 2.4%. He had essentially discovered germ theory before germ theory existed. The medical establishment rejected him completely. His colleagues mocked him. His supervisor dismissed the findings. The idea that doctors, educated, respectable gentlemen, could be the ones killing their patients was considered insulting. Semmelweis grew increasingly desperate and erratic. He was eventually committed to a mental asylum at age 47. He died 2 weeks later, likely from sepsis. An infected wound on his hand. The father of antisepsis died of the exact thing he'd spent his career trying to prevent. And babies weren't safe either, not even at home. If your baby was crying in Victorian England and you were a working mother, there was a product for that. It was called Godfrey's Cordial. It was laudanum, liquid opium, mixed with treacle to make it sweet. You gave it to your baby to make them quiet while you went to work. One Manchester druggist admitted to selling half a gallon of Godfrey's Cordial every single week, plus 6 additional gallons of a generic version called, and I am not making this up, quietness. Babies were being chemically silenced by the gallon. In 1854, a physician estimated that 3/4 of all opium deaths in Britain were children under 5. One 9-month-old died from 4 drops of laudanum given over 9 hours. And if you think that's insane, in 1898, Bayer introduced heroin as a children's cough suppressant. Yes, that Bayer, the aspirin company. They marketed it specifically for kids and didn't stop producing it until 1910. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, packed with morphine, was sold for teething infants and stayed on the market until 1930. This is the part where I have to tell you about the drowning treatment, because it is the most absurd thing in this entire video. In 1774, the London Royal Humane Society, which still exists today, was founded specifically to revive drowning victims. They installed publicly accessible rescue kits along the Thames River, like 18th century defibrillators. The kits contained a tube and a bellows. For a tobacco smoke enema, the treatment for drowning was inserting a tube into the victim's rectum and pumping tobacco smoke inside. The belief was that the warmth would stimulate respiration. Lifeguards were trained in this. It was the official recommended emergency procedure. Then, in 1811, a scientist proved that nicotine was toxic, meaning the treatment was actively poisoning the patients. Then in 1829, a French physician discovered that the bellows used to pump the smoke could rupture the air sacs in the lungs. Both halves of the standard drowning rescue kit were independently lethal. The kit designed to save drowning victims was killing them from two different directions at once. So here's what we covered. Benjamin Rush built a medical system so logically airtight and so completely wrong that it killed thousands, including George Washington, and stayed in use for 60 years because the treatments were violent enough to hide their own side effects. Mercury was prescribed in doses that rotted faces off, and doctors took remission as proof it was working. The fastest surgeon in London killed 3 people with 1 operation, and the anesthetic meant to fix surgery made it worse. The doctor who discovered hand washing was committed to an asylum and died of the thing he'd spent his career fighting. Babies were sold opium by the gallon, and the official treatment for drowning was a tobacco enema that poisoned and ruptured lungs simultaneously. The most horrifying part of all of this isn't that these people were stupid. They weren't. Rush was brilliant. Liston was the best in the world at what he did. Semmelweis's insight was genuinely revolutionary. The horror is that they were all working with complete confidence inside systems that were killing people, and the systems were designed in ways that made the killing invisible. If you thought this was disturbing, wait until you see what we cover next. Drop a comment with the most insane fact from this video. I want to know which one broke your brain, and if you're not subscribed yet, you're going to miss the next one. Trust me, you don't want to do that.